Hey, and welcome to the webinar. If you're joining in, feel free to get settled, grab a beverage, fix your coffee. We are going to wait a couple minutes just to let people kind of come in and get settled. But while you're joining the webinar, feel free to use our chat button, which is located in your control panel in the center, and let us know where you're signing in from. Hey, welcome. It's nice to see some folks in State College. For those of you who are joining, we're just waiting a couple minutes to let everyone get settled in. You can use the chat feature to say hello. Our chat will be moderated, and so if you want to say hi or where you're from, feel free to use the chat for that. Hey, thanks for coming. It's nice to see fellow Philadelphians here. It's nice to see you. We'll just give it one more minute, let folks trap in, and then we'll get started. Awesome. Well, I think we'll get started. So today we are talking about lessons learned from modernizing legacy applications. Our expectations about an app's capabilities and ease of use are higher than ever before. And businesses are becoming increasingly defined by the digital experiences they offer, not only their customers, but also their employees. And especially large organizations really face a unique challenge in terms of meeting market demands while also supporting and evolving the tools and technologies that their current customers and employees are already using. So we'll talk a lot about the best ways for company leaders and UX teams to traverse those waters and successfully launch and update applications and business tools that you use in a way that meets today's standard. We'll be joined by an expert group of panelists today of designers and technologists who have done this work at enterprise organizations, and they'll talk through some of the lessons that they've learned in modernizing legacy apps in these environments and how you can apply those same learnings to your own work. For those of you who are new to Think Company, just a little bit about us. If you haven't heard about us before, we are an experienced design and technology consultancy in Philadelphia. We work with a team of more than 100 thinkers who are experts at research, design, development, and managing digital products that are beautiful and easy to use. We help our clients achieve their business goals by improving digital experience for their customers and their employees. In the current environment, we've all seen how important these kinds of digital experiences are for business continuity, and we help our clients create world-class digital experiences. So if you're involved in helping your organization with something like this or have goals like this in mind, You can find our contact info at thinkcompany.com, or you can go to the URL in this link to start a conversation with one of our experts. Moving on to today's panel, my name is Colleen. I'll be your MC for the day, and I'd love to introduce you to our panel of experts, starting with Alyssa Martin, who is a principal experience designer here at Think Company. Alyssa brings a thoughtful and systematic approach to bringing digital experiences to life. Her past experience in creating and maintaining design systems, crafting responsive web and native mobile application solutions, and establishing trusted partnerships across product teams has allowed her to influence and ship both enterprise-level and consumer-facing products across the telecommunications, entertainment, and manufacturing industries. We'll also be joined by Britt Browse, who is a senior content strategist here at Think Company. Beginning her career in publishing and pivoting to fast-paced tech startups and agencies, Britt brings more than a decade of content strategy and digital marketing expertise to her role as senior content strategist. Her strategic decisions are powered by best practices in user experience, content, search, and measurement. And with a deep interest in how people search, discover, and engage with content, Britt helps design content frameworks that meet user needs. We'll also be joined by Erica Wolstadter, a principal researcher here at Think. Erica brings more than 20 years of UX and consulting experience to the table. She's worked for such clients as Salesforce, Facebook, General Motors, Genentech, ADP, and Caterpillar. And as a former developer and visual designer, she's developed a unique and holistic perspective on software and site development. Her passion is internal systems and B2B solutions, simply put, the programs that make people's lives easier. And finally, we'll be joined by Stu DePoy, a senior technical lead here. Stu has spent a decade as a technology consultant fostering innovative solutions through customer service. He has led diverse technical teams to tackle complex problems across industries, including the US public sector, pharmaceutical, media, and fintech. From technical delivery to compliance assessments and roadmap development, he's a trusted advisor for the potential of customers' platforms. By establishing strong working relationships, Stu builds camaraderie between his team and client partners to drive consensus on projects and ensure success for all. And with that, I'd love to take it over to our panelist. Stu, if you want to jump in, I'm going to shut off here and we'll get started with the panel.
Thanks so much, Colleen. Really appreciate the summary there and the introductions for all of us. So we've kind of organized this conversation a little bit chronologically with respect to an app modernizing project. So the questions that we ask at the beginning may impact the more early stages of a project. And as we get into the conversation, we'll kind of progress more into deeper within that timeline. And as Colleen mentioned, app modernization is all about looking at your current situation and understanding how you can take those legacy systems into the next phase of your business and strategy. So with that, let's jump right in and prompt our panelists with our first question. So what is the value of modernizing versus working with something that you might already have?
So from a research perspective, I can tackle this because research is often one of the first things that you look at when it comes to updating any systems that you currently have. Because before you can make decisions in a new system, you have to have information that that reflects those new systems, or even helps you evaluate whether or not you want to be updating or how much you want to be updating. Quite often you will have, existing systems that you need to maintain while developing new ones. So information and research that you've done to support the old systems may not necessarily reflect those new ones. Do you have that new source of truth? Have you evaluated how much of your data that you'll be able to reuse? in your new systems? And how confident are you when it comes to the data that you're using in order to drive new decisions and to evaluate potential solutions moving forward?
Yeah, this is Britt chiming in from a content point of view. I think in order to make a decision about modernizing versus using existing content, a really good decision-making tool would be to do an inventory and couple that with a complete audit of your content. So you would want to find out, quantitatively, how much content do you have? What does that look like? And then qualitatively use some criteria and heuristics to determine how good the content is at meeting your users' needs. And from that point, you can really decide, what do you want to keep? What do you want to update? What do you want to remove completely? It's also critical to look at your competitor space and decide, what are they doing? Are there some gaps out there that you could be filling as well? Another content area to really look at to decide, how much do I want to change this and really redesign would be your information architecture. So, how is the content and information in your app organized? Is it intuitive? Is it easy for people to discover? Sometimes that can be a content strategy fix or solution, and sometimes it's a little bit more tied in and married to the UI and the design. So that's some decision making there that you can do. And then the other opportunity that you would have in modernizing from a content point of view would be to move toward more structured content. This can really future-proof your entire strategy. And if you do the foundational work to model out your content and really break it down to an elemental level and find out, what kind of pieces do I have? How do they fit together and relate to each other? How do users interact with this content? You can start to decouple those content pieces from your visual design. And that puts you in a place where you could get closer to like a create the content once and then publish it everywhere strategy. And that's kind of like the holy grail. So I think modernizing will help us to, lay that foundation and get some of that work done and move towards more of that kind of structured content strategy.
Yeah, to add to that from a design perspective, I think we like to think about, what are the ways we can implement these small incremental improvements over time? And these improvements should be scalable and allow for future changes with minimal effort. So the value for us is, in this context, really about having an efficient design system. So it provides us with, the framework of tools that we need to do our job more efficiently, which ends up, producing a more consistent outcome for, the product and the experience overall for users. And I think also that ties into, directly to the user perspective. So if users are constantly seeing improvement over time, bugs are fixed, new features are added, this could happen in record time, compared to what organizations were capable of even in the past couple of years. Tools and systems, I think, have really helped in producing efficiencies and cutting out wasted time. So this can have a direct impact, on improving engagement, overall perception of the product, and your brand in general. And so I'm sure many of you are thinking about the business perspective too. The value here comes from the speed at which your teams are able to work, your release cycles. So really just being able to iterate on your product quickly based on testing and feedback is really one of the main reasons to modernize, especially if you're thinking about your competition.
To piggyback off that, Alyssa, with respect to speed and efficiency, you're going to need to think about your architecture overall, think about the cost of switching, but even beyond that, your architecture needs to be as nimble as your project team is and your organization. A project is only going to move as fast as its slowest part. So if you're constantly troubleshooting CI/CD issues all the time, you're not going to be able to focus on developing meaningful features and impacting meaningful change to your end users. We have a great blog post that was written by a technology manager at Think about his feelings, very strong feelings about Jenkins. If any of you have used Jenkins as a CI/CD tool, you may have similar feelings. But similarly, you look at deployment tools and hosting platforms, AWS, Azure, Jamstack, Netlify, all of these considerations can fit into that efficiency and speed. For us at Think Company, we love Netlify, Pantheon for their ease of use and rapid deployment. It really does take away a lot of those impediments to getting a tool deployed quickly. And so with that, what I'm hearing all of us kind of say together, it really all comes down to participation and representation, data-driven decision-making when you're analyzing what you have, what you want to keep, and what you want to replace, and making sure you set time aside for exploration and can support parallel work tracks potentially. Before we move on to the next question, I do just want to point out that the Q&A functionality within Zoom is active. Please feel free to drop any and all questions either in the chat or in the Q&A portion of Zoom. And we'll have a session at the very end to review those and answer any questions you may have. So with that, let's move on to our next topic here. And it's all about understanding your organization's feelings and some of that change management. So do you know how everyone in your org feels about this change that you're embarking on? And if not, how do you find out?
Yeah, I think before anything else, it helps to understand the product vision. So we as consultants want to know not just today's vision, but for the next 3 to 5 years. What does that look like for your organization? What's the risk tolerance for change in the organization? And also, we want to know what the UX maturity level of the organization is. Does UX even fit into that vision today? Is it modeled anywhere? Or do we really need to work hard to educate our stakeholders on best practices? Most importantly, I think, is leadership aligned with the vision? If there isn't a shared vision in that respect, there's no point in moving forward. But also it helps to understand the culture, how transparent is the organization? Teams should be encouraged to communicate regularly and work together, but silos do exist, and we need to be aware of them and when that's the case. Also, I want to mention, just regarding process, I'll say this is a big one. I've seen this a lot. Is there a change management plan in place? And what does that look like? And who's responsible for it? And how will that effort be managed? I think setting expectations with all the various stakeholders of the legacy product is a big piece of the puzzle. They don't like surprises. You don't like surprises if they don't understand the vision and haven't been involved in the process throughout the entire project or redesign. It's going to create added time and stress down the road if you don't have their buy-in. So creating those touch points, for those types of conversations is your best bet in the very beginning of the project. And really communicating, what you've tried so far, what you've learned, what you'll be trying next, any risks you see. And as long as you have that constant dialogue with the external stakeholders, really building that rapport, that's really the main takeaway here, I think, for me.
Yeah, I love everything that you just said, Alyssa, and I agree fully with the no surprises theme. I think, from a content strategy point of view, sometimes we get pigeonholed as just being worried about the stuff that's in the app or on the website, the words, the articles, the videos, but really we're also very involved in the process and the people that are necessary to take that content through a complex workflow, take it through a compliance or legal review, approvals, updates. So we really need to have people and process on our side. When we get started, working in an enterprise environment, it's just about asking how content is managed today and who's involved, who's missing from those conversations, what's working, what the pain points are. And it's not just about, finding out how it's done current state, but also when you're having those conversations, really reading the room and trying to uncover the why. Why is it being done the way it is today? Is there some champion that was, trying to push a certain tool set or system for doing it that way? How do people feel about, the way the content's moving through this organization? And I think Alyssa mentioned silos. A lot of times we'll discover, opportunities for, one group in an organization is developing this amazing content, and this other group over here doesn't know about that. And so just trying to facilitate those kinds of bridges and filling in those gaps and getting, the best content out there to the user is really, how to manage that. So it's all about getting people involved early and often, keeping them updated. And again, just no surprises when you do eventually roll out a strategy or a change. People should feel pretty bought in at that point.
And to that point, from a research perspective, how do you know that people are bought in? We'd like to think when we're kicking off a new initiative, a new feature set, a new platform, that everybody is just as gung-ho about it as we are. But quite often, people fail to take the temperature of the company, of the business unit, of the department, to get a sense of how people in your organization are actually feeling about this process and what will be happening, both from a procedural perspective and from a user perspective. One of the best things that we recommend is to, conduct a workshop, get into exercises capturing how people feel about this process, where they think that they fit into the process, capturing their worries, their fears, their hopes. It may sound somewhat emotional, but the fact is that, we've all seen really good plans, really good initiatives, go astray because people don't think about how departments, business units, everyone is going to be impacted by potential structural changes when you modernize your application. Like, there are ripple effects. If you have features that are getting baked into a new application, well, what happens to the people who were in charge of it previously? So looking at it from like an organizational perspective is incredibly valuable, and having that data on what are people worried about, how are people really feeling about this, and that can help you plan for any potential pitfalls that you might encounter when it comes to kicking off that process.
Yeah, exactly. I think the phrase that I hear all the time and use all the time is decisions like this should not be made in a vacuum. And when we're talking at the enterprise level, it takes a lot of coordination to steer an aircraft carrier. These are large organizations that require communication plans, coordination between multiple teams, and making sure everybody has a seat at the table is absolutely critical to the ultimate success of these sorts of projects. So I think what I'm hearing is that it really comes down to how well departments communicate, who owns what. Do you understand process and organizational changes that are needed to support the work that's happening? Also ensure you understand who's driving the change on the org side and why and what the motivation is behind that change. This is something that happens everywhere, whether you want it to or not. So working as a team is absolutely critical. And speaking of success and success metrics, our next topic is around that exactly. So do you understand what success looks like, and how do you measure it, and how can you find out what success looks like?
So how one of the best ways that you can find out what your success metrics are is really just Well, from the previous step, what Britt had mentioned about getting the right people in the room is getting an understanding of what success looks like for each individual. Early on, we like to emphasize a lot of internal discovery research. A lot of companies tend to think of research as something that we do with just the users, or we just are we're investigating third-party marketing research or what have you, and not something that they're doing internally. But it is a tool that you can use internally to get a lot of really valuable data. For instance, if stakeholder A thinks that success means upping a particular metric by 10%, and the other one thinks that dropping that metric by 5% is the way to go, then you have a severe incongruity when it comes to measuring success for your project overall. Getting people to sit down and talk with one another, as well as gathering that data over what everyone thinks success is really important. Also, distinguishing business and experiential metrics. This is absolutely key. And oftentimes people don't really distinguish between the two of them. What it looks like for a product to impact the business is often very different than what it means to impact the user. And you want to make sure that you're keeping track of both of those categories and not, making connections or dependencies upon sets of numbers that really don't have anything to do with each other. So establishing reasonable guidelines for what everybody can agree on when it comes to success is super important when starting off your project. Like, this step can happen kind of at any phase, but the earlier you do it, the earlier you have everyone in alignment on what success actually looks like. And that means that people won't get disappointed later if a number is off, or users aren't as happy as you think they're going to be.
Yeah, and what Erica is referring to, I think, is a lot of the big picture success. Overall, how do we know that this app modernization project is going to be successful on a large scale? I like to think that in order to achieve large scale success, you need to do little things right along the way. And when you do a lot of little things right day to day, hour to hour, overall, you're contributing to the larger success of the program, of the organization. So really, when you get down into the nitty gritty tactical side of it, you need to think about, this sounds so silly, but it is true. Are you building from a development perspective? Are you building to spec? Are you actually building what is being designed by, your design partners? Are you ensuring that the message is making it across from team to team? That's going to minimize as much rework as you can, and it'll ultimately open up your team to be more nimble, more efficient, move quickly. Furthermore, are you crushing your technical debt? Are you operating in a manner that is preventing technical debt? And we'll talk about debt in just a few moments, but are you addressing accessibility concerns? Are you ensuring that you're building in an accessible fashion? And like I mentioned, how often do you need to refactor your code? All of these small things day to day that can be addressed in your sprint work and in your scrums potentially are what are going to build up into larger scale success over time. So it's hard to get little, or it's hard to be on a project day to day and think about, am I contributing to the overall vision of this project? When you have to, think small sometimes and put one foot in front of the other.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think another thing about, measurement and success is to keep in mind that you have to keep reevaluating along the way. So whatever you agree on and determine and align on are those goals for the business, for the user. As we work through the design process, we're going to look back at our research findings, and we're going to look back at those goals, and we're going to evaluate decisions based on whether we're continuing to be aligned with them. From a content point of view, success to me also looks like, is the content in the app meeting your users' needs? Are they getting what they need? Are they getting the right content at the right time? And are they taking, a desired action in the app? Another way we could measure, success of a content strategy program would also be, our content workflows or processes, are they going to add value and save you time and resources in a regulated environment or an enterprise environment? If you can reduce the amount of resources or time that it takes or steps to get something through compliance or to get something updated across multiple teams, that could also be a really big win for you.
Yeah, also design validation through usability testing is another big success metric. Building in that continuous learning from users, being able to test, get that feedback, and then iterate on your product is one of your better ways to ensure the UI and experience is as good as it can be for your users. And I think also just generally speaking, measuring success should be based on outcomes and not specific features. I think we get focused on solutioning or meeting demands of competition that we sometimes lose sight of, what the feature is and why it was built in the first place. So what are we even measuring with that? So just need to remember to zoom out and not get tied to one solution, one feature.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've learned so much more about some of the quantitative success metrics in my time at Think Company, using metrics like NASA TLX we've used on a project recently, your SUS score, to have very concrete, measurable impact over time, I think is something that I had not had a whole lot of exposure to until my time at Think Company. But it makes so much more concrete sense. And so what I'm hearing overall is that success is something that needs to be evaluated throughout the process. And each discipline has their own way of measuring success. So I mentioned debt, right? It's scary. It's not something that we like to talk about all the time, but it's necessary. So debt, a lack of knowledge or resources such as time, equipment, personnel, that's what we're referring to debt as. It comes in many flavors. So how do you know what kind and how much debt you have? How do you address it and make time for it?
Yeah, I think we all know what this feels like. There seems to be inconsistencies everywhere, a lack of organization, the brand is feeling disjointed. It's honestly so easy to get into a pattern of this disarray instead of actually doing it correctly. That's why we see the pattern so often. So when you have a lot of products within your ecosystem, there tend to be silos, as we mentioned before, and there aren't proper channels in place to connect all the dots. So that just leads to this compounding debt, and what's happening here is this breakdown of systems, and it could look differently across organizations. It could be that tangible debt that's easy to spot. Physically, I see that the UI looks disjointed, or it could be more usable or more accessible. This debt, it could be due to a lack of design system, which is supposed to connect all the work streams and products within the ecosystem. If design and development are misaligned, it tends to produce visible inconsistencies in the experience. But what's harder, I think, to spot, is, what Stu mentioned, the intangible process of debt, the lack of communication, the lack of leadership or missing roles, people to help facilitate your work, and remove blockers instead of adding new ones to your list. Just the overall lack of process and priority. But I think all that to say, though, it's not just one person or one team's fault. It really comes down to, good leadership and a good system. So being able to identify what's missing by conducting, an audit, synthesizing those results, and implementing formalized processes so that everyone is able to put them into practice. And really that is what leads to the cycle of continuous improvement over time.
I think formalized process is a huge thing here, right? So on the tech team, we have coding standards, right? Think Company actually has public coding standards. We've put a lot of work into updating them and keeping them maintained as an organization. And they're open to the public. Anybody can go out and find them. So anybody who's on the call today that wants to go look at our coding standards, you know, I'm putting it out there. But that formal process, having the coding standards is one thing, but holding your developers to those standards is a different piece. It's a different beast, right? So the code review process is huge to make sure that you are following that standardized process. And that really is one major way to prevent the creation of debt. You know, and that's the best way to mitigate debt, is to not have any debt. But that's kind of a wishful thinking. There's always going to be some debt that needs to be addressed. And you really need to attack it head on, whether it's accessibility debt or other technical debt. Integrating that into your normal sprint cadence is a surefire way to make sure that it gets done. You know, if you keep putting it off for other feature work, you know, things can really balloon out of control. You could be implementing features that break other parts of your application. It just gets really messy, and then you have to go back, refactor your code base, all that stuff. Nobody wants to do that. It's not fun. So things like coding standards, leveraging automated testing, not only can it help speed up your end-to-end process, it can also help prevent the overall debt that you accrue, and thus limiting the debt that you need to incorporate in your day-to-day sprint work.
So speaking about like different kinds of debt, when it comes to research, there's the very visible one. There's the obvious one of the things that we don't yet know about our programs, about our features, about our users. And part of that, you know, goes back to the first question about like, is your data still valid? Like, are you doing regular audits? Do you have a process by which you're evaluating the things that you have to see if they're still useful? You know, but there's also the second part, which is the hidden knowledge, the implicit knowledge. Implicit knowledge is defined as something that you believe is assumed about a topic. And there's a lot of implicit knowledge when it comes to your applications, whether it's organizational. Hey, it's this person over in this department who handles you know, these kinds of requests, or it's like, oh yeah, we tried that system previously and it didn't work out. Like, there's a lot of implicit knowledge floating around in your organization that you're probably not aware of. This is sometimes known as like brain debt, or, you know, brain trust debt, that like when personnel are lost or are transferred, they take their knowledge with them. And how are you capturing that knowledge as you're going through this process, or even just in the day-to-day? Quite often when it comes to implementing new solutions, it can feel like you're starting from scratch or just starting all over again. But maybe somebody explored a particular platform solution like a year ago, and that information is still valid. But how would you know that they did that? Like, do you have a place where you are storing this implicit knowledge, way that you are capturing processes and connections in a way that everyone can easily access and refer to? We tend to think of onboarding as something that is one and done, but onboarding is a continuous process, because as new people, as new processes are added to an organization, all of this can turn into a bunch of hidden knowledge that someone is just expected to piece together. And that can be lost over time, especially when it comes to creating something new or adopting a new system. And I think this is especially relevant for content, Britt.
Yeah, I would say, you know, from a content point of view, the biggest issue I see, you know, in terms of debt would be probably just like when a legacy app might have a fixed design template, or some kind of CMS setup that's really hamstringing you from, doing what you want to do with the content in the app or experience. So that's like one pitfall there to watch out for. The other, it's not really debt, but the other thing I would look out for as a problem would be, if there's no inventory or audit that you do up front at the beginning of your design process in terms of your content. It might seem counterintuitive, but like less is more when it comes to content. And so being able to let go of, any articles or content or resources that are no longer serving your users' needs, that'll save you time on the back end, because what you'll end up doing is supporting this content ongoing, even though it's not serving any great purpose on the app or experience, and that'll just weigh you down.
So I'm hearing some commonalities here between all of our answers. And basically, debt, it can be difficult to track and may require specialized resources like accessibility experts, content strategists. Keeping track of that hidden knowledge and process becomes an integral part of avoiding debt. So I think we only have like 4 or 5 more minutes left on our panel, and then we'll shift to Q&A. But we have one more question to get to before we move into that. So finally, we're looking at the handoffs between teams, between maybe Think Company and our client partners, maybe a third-party developer, whomever it may be. So how do you make sure things are smooth during handoffs, and how do you avoid things getting lost in translation?
Yeah, this is the hard part. It all comes back to communication is hard. But I think transparency and that shared understanding is so critical to successful teams. One thing I'll say though, for teams practicing Agile, there should already be that constant communication between their cross-functional partners. So everyone should know, who are the key members of my team? Do I have regular current touch points? Who's responsible for what? It's really the little things that matter when it comes to building rapport and respect with your teams and other external stakeholders that you might eventually need to get buy-in from. It shouldn't be looked at as, slowing down the process. Especially with design, it isn't just done by designers. We rely on our partners to help guide us in our decision-making and really ultimately affect, the tangible output of what we produce. So, while there is a certain degree, I think, of greenlighting for design for a dev team, there should be no surprises, because you've already communicated that intent, really, and the goals around the feature, deliverables before getting buy-in. That said, a shared information repository, shared communication tooling like Confluence, Figma, Zoom, they've all been game changers, for teams to make it so much easier, to communicate and document intent. And I know Stu can attest to this one too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when I think about this handoff, I just think about some of the projects we've worked on and what we've done to make that transition so much more smooth. And the main thing I point to is the use of a pattern library. In the project I'm referring to, where Alyssa and I were working together as design and tech lead, we built out a pattern library in Storybook. And if you're not familiar with Storybook as a UI library tool, it's a favorite of Think Company, and I highly recommend it. If you haven't used it, go check it out. So we leveraged Storybook for a third-party developer that was actually implementing the designs. And Storybook is a coded UI library where the developers could take that and have actual code, real live CSS design tokens that they could directly implement into their application. And even before we get to design, right? Tech is heavily involved in feasibility. I always come into a project and perform a technical discovery before we even get started in design, to understand things about the architecture we're working within, the application, the frameworks, anything that a client may already have that's going to impact design. For example, I recently shared a couple of Salesforce training modules with our designers, so that they had a more deep understanding of the capabilities of Salesforce, specifically within the Lightning design experience that they would then be building out their new interface in. So, and we're constantly going back and forth, asking questions about features and the level of customization required within a platform like Salesforce, so that they're not building a design that is beautiful and functional and everything that we want it to be, and then hitting those brick walls to say, this is great, but it's going to cost a whole lot for you to implement it, and we can't really do it. That's really what we're trying to avoid at the end of the day. So all that to say, transparency is key, as is understanding the parties that need to be in the room. Build that shared language, that shared vocabulary, and standards for what form deliverables will also take. Understand the standards for your deliverables, and do the people who need deliverables have access to them? So those are our main questions for our panel. I think we've got some Q&A here. Colleen, if you want to come back in and help us out with that, that would be great.
Yeah, thanks so much. And thanks everyone on the panel. This was amazing. I did want to start with one question that's been upvoted a few times and feels very familiar. So this person writes, hello. Most of our leadership team believes they already know the tools and features our customers want. What are your suggestions for convincing them that the time and budget investment in user research is not just a nice to have? And I'd love to start this one off with Erica and then maybe open it up to the whole panel.
So this is something that is absolutely foundational when it comes to my work. And in fact, I consider it like my job is 70% research and 30% convincing people to do research. So this one comes up a lot. And a lot of it has to do with how you show the value of research. That there's a couple different ways, but one of the most effective tactics is in time saved. There was a previous project that I was on, will not name names. They had been designing it for an entire year, like full dev team, internal designers, etc. We came on, we were like, hey, please let us just do some guerrilla testing, some quick user feedback, and discovered that it was almost unusable. That was an entire year's worth of work, almost completely down the drain because they hadn't done any testing along the way. Now, all of us are familiar with that, but those kinds of stories really help underline the need for research. So what you can do is, think about how much time you'll save by doing testing at various points and the kind of testing that will have the most impact. In my experience, once stakeholders get a taste for what research can deliver, the information that it can provide, the arguments that it can prevent, the meetings that it can keep you from having to have, once they get a taste of that, it's much easier to get more research done. So once you can get your foot in the door with just like a little light user validation testing, showing that, hey, if we test this now, we won't need to make major changes like once this goes to development. So showcasing like that kind of snowball value over the lifespan of a project really helps you get your research foot in the door.
Yeah, and I'll say even from the dev and tech perspective, we're always going back to the research to understand why decisions were made. It's not so much about what we're building, it's understanding why we're building it, so that we have that alignment in vision. And, you know, I would even argue to say that, you know, at Think Company, we are a data-driven organization. And if leadership or a group of leaders is saying that, oh, we already know what we want to build, we know the features, we know the functionality, we want to understand the data behind that decision. And if you don't have data and we do have data, you know, which makes the more compelling argument?
Yeah, I think people also do this with content as well. Like I've been in a lot of environments where, you know, we think we might know what kind of content someone needs, and then we learn that that's really different from user testing. Do you have anything to add, Britt, about, you know, tips you might have or questions you might ask to start thinking about that?
Yeah, I was just thinking about that, and yeah, from a content point of view, I think, you know, it helps to keep like pushing the envelope and asking those questions throughout. And you know, I talked about an audit and an inventory, and that's important. It's critical to do that up front. But that continuous evaluation of success and, you know, looking at how people are interacting, looking at research throughout the process. And then also, you know, in some cases with an enterprise work, you know, you have an idea about a certain kind of content that you might want to pull in, and you're told no. And that happens a lot. And within that same project, if it's a couple months long and you're on the same team, you might start to get to yes eventually. So I'd say, you know, if you have data to back it up from the users, from competitors, you can, you know, keep pushing to make sure you're delivering the best content.
Yeah, awesome. There's another question here I'd love to kick off to Alyssa. Someone asked in the Q&A, how can I incrementally refactor and redesign a complex UI while not hindering the user experience or our ability to simultaneously deliver new features?
Yeah, that's a good one. It's definitely a good idea to minimize the amount of change at one time, or at the very least, just prepare users or customers for it. You know, typically we recommend a phased approach, you know, a supported agile program. Moving to those smaller, more iterative improvements will lessen the amount of change at once. But also to just reinforce the idea of the changes that are coming. So again, back to the communication piece of working with marketing or sales or customer service team to really just figure out how to best communicate that to the user. Again, you know, back to that change management piece, you know, making sure everyone is on the same page.
So, and along those lines as well, it's oftentimes when we think of like modernization or coming up with a new solution, we are trying to minimize the wasted effort that we expend. But any transition period is going to involve a certain number of sacrificial lambs. Sacrificial lamb is a feature or a piece of content or something that is created for an old system that will cease to exist, you know, once the new system is launched. And sometimes you're just going to need these, not just to like help people transition between the two applications, but because oftentimes you have your old system existing simultaneously alongside while you're building your new one. And so really think long and hard about the value of perhaps introducing a new and exciting feature into the old system to help people learn and adapt to that new system. Even though that old code or that old feature is going to go away. Like sacrificial lambs, they may seem a little wasteful, but they're also really good at, you know, taking the temperature of the organization about a particular feature or trying something out that might not exist, you know, after you're done there.
Yeah, I think that leads into a great question for all of you that I'd love to just open up to everyone. really around just like changing attitudes and changing minds. So someone here was curious what your advice would be for changing old thought processes for this kind of work and moving towards more innovation. So I just wanted to open up this up to the group. I think it's a great question for everybody.
Yeah, I'll jump in, Colleen. Innovation is such a broad term, right? You can have many different flavors of innovation. In the past, working with the U.S. public sector specifically, the process through which you have new tools approved can take a very long time. There's lots of security assessments, compliance assessments that are gatekeepers to adopting new technologies. And I found in some of those projects that I kind of had to work with the tools that were at my disposal. So innovation doesn't necessarily mean groundbreaking new pieces of technology or new platforms. It could be using the existing platforms you have in new ways. So let's say you have an ETL engine, extract, transform, load, that you are using in a different department or different way. You could maybe leverage that as a piece of middleware that services, new file imports and understanding to an application that you already have. So especially in enterprises that are large and have very varied and different departments that all operate differently, reaching out across departments to understand how one another operates, and what tools they have at their disposal that are already adopted within the organization that can be leveraged in new ways, I think is a great way to get the ball rolling on some of that resistance to significant change.
And along those lines, thinking about, what Stu said about repurposing old tools, I think it's twofold. One, you have to understand what got you into the situation in the first place, where you need to do this huge revamp, really looking and cataloging and thinking long and hard about, what failed in your existing or previous process that got you to this point, and also thinking about what are the things that you don't need to throw away? What are the things that you don't need to reinvent? Maybe everybody is perfectly comfortable sharing your research findings in PowerPoints because that's what your organization likes to use. That's not a thing that you have to invent. Everything doesn't need to go out with the bathwater. And that's especially important when it comes to thinking about like the internal tools that you're using, in addition to the ones that you are revamping for your users.
And it's that circles right back to our first lesson, right? How do we understand what's worth working with versus what to modernize?
Yeah, I wanted to just jump in a little on this one too. And I agree with everyone's points that it's helpful to remain like tool agnostic, and to kind of work with what people are comfortable with. But I will say, the benefit of working with, an outside team, and having folks like us come in is that, we've seen a lot of this kind of change and innovation happen in an array of organizations. And so you're bringing in this outside point of view to those conversations. And we can point to, examples of, how things have been done on other projects or in other places. And I think that can be really powerful in terms of moving the dial.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like when we talk about innovation, this is such a great topic and I get really excited about it. Innovation isn't always a thing. It is an improvement. And so when you are improving the lives of someone, it can be a process, it can be a tool, and it doesn't have to equal we are changing wholesale everything that we do here and how we do it. And
yeah, I think, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Stu. No, please.
No, I just going to say we've mentioned it a couple of times in this conversation about incremental improvement and doing small things along the way to ultimately have a large impact. and that can be innovation too, to your point.
Yeah. We're wrapping up. We're rounding up to about 4 o'clock. Our panelists can stay until 4:15. We do have one more question to get through, so feel free to stick around if you'd like to hear it. You will receive a recording of this webinar if you can't stay past 4. But let's head off to our last question. So our last question here says, I'm trying to scale my research in my organization and improve the impact our research has on the actual product decisions. Any tips on how I can do that?
I can tackle this one, at least at first, because I think scaling is something that impacts everyone, that every discipline has to deal with this problem eventually, which is that, like, if you start off with 1 or 2 researchers, it's very easy to, communicate amongst yourselves, and you don't need extremely large or complex processes for handling decision making, or like information gathering. This is something that I'm dealing with on a current project, which is, how do you add more people and how do you create processes from nothing? Because when we think about modernization, when we think about improving, we tend to think, oh, we've got this existing thing. What if you are actually creating something from nothing? And oftentimes that can really trip people up when it comes to process, when it comes to an organizational perspective. And there are a lot of resources out there around just in general best practices, but you do have to be thinking about, like, what are the tools that everybody is comfortable receiving information with? What are the gaps that we currently have in our research that can be met by a larger research team, as well as, like, well, how are we making research-based decisions moving forward? Your project may get so large that you can't always have a researcher in every meeting where decisions are being made. So then what kind of database or knowledge pool do you have that people can go to get answers that research turned up? So do you have a research wiki? Do you have, even like a SharePoint with a bunch of easily labeled PowerPoints in it? That you need to think long and hard about your document structure and organization when it comes to sharing information as you scale up. And I think this is something that especially impacts content, as like content strategy grows with an organization as well.
Yes, if it's not documented, it didn't happen.
Yeah, I'd love to hear from Alyssa. Do you have any tips on kind of pulling research insights into the overall design process? Like, how do you kind of share those during, after some of the user testing has been done?
It's a great question. I would say that could be done, concurrently with, 2 agile tracks. You could have your iterative release team working on improving the legacy system, but then you could also be, testing new designs with, current users, or, a usertesting.com pool of users at the same time. So what you're doing is, you're improving the existing experience, but you're also testing new and improved designs at the same time. So that's definitely something to be able to do, at the same time is to your best benefit there.
Yeah, absolutely. Stu, what about from the technical perspective? Can you think of any like unexpected or interesting ways you've seen research pulled into your process, or even, the development cycle?
Yeah, I think I touched on it a little bit. with respect to communicating between teams, right? It's more about understanding the why we're building something versus what it is that we're building. So I would say, for example, if I'm building out a navigation bar that the designer has put 3 levels of fly out in, that's 3 or more, right? We've got a lot of problems with that from an implementation standpoint. There's accessibility concerns that we have to think of. And, I may go back to the designer and say, let's talk about the reason that you want this to have 5 levels of fly out. And maybe rethink this a little bit and see if something that is more simple fits into the research narrative.
Yeah, I can also weigh in. When we're making decisions about, what we're including in an app, what kind of content, what it's called, we're pointing back to the research findings, making sure we're thinking about the user first. And then, there's a lot of activities we can do from a content point of view to ensure that, we're making research-driven decisions. So, mapping out like the domain of the industry that we're building something for, to understand, all of the different elements that we need to cover. What are they called? Doing things like card sorts to understand, how do folks inside your organization refer to this thing, and then how do the users refer to it, and then trying to find a happy medium to get everybody kind of aligned around that in the designer app. So.
Yeah. Well, I think that's all of our questions. I just want to take a moment and say thank you to all of our panelists. Thanks to everyone for attending. We have a couple of quick housekeeping items. Just to wrap up here, thanks again for all of the great insight. I found myself taking notes myself during the panel. And for those of you who did join us, just a heads up, you will receive a follow-up email with links to everything the panelists referenced and the recording as well. And we'd love your feedback on this webinar. So you'll have a link to a 2-minute survey to talk to us about what you learned and what we could do better. And if you'd like to grab a virtual coffee with our panelists, you can use the link in this deck to do so, to grab some time, and we'll schedule some time with you to speak with them. And for the rest of you, thanks so much for joining us, and I hope that you have a great day. Thanks again to our panelists.